Okay, so I wanted to talk about one of the themes of Focus on Change, which is noting abrupt diminishings. And my simple one-word label for that is gone. But as with all the words that I use, virtually all the words that I use, we have to be careful because the meaning is not identical to the meaning in colloquial English. When we say gone, it implies gone for good, typically. It's like gone and it ain't coming back. But gone is just an abrupt diminishing of something that you happen to notice has abruptly diminished. So it doesn't mean that it won't come back instantly, but it's still gone. Also, gone does not imply every part of it is gone. You could be observing an image, and let's say it's a person, so there's a head, there's arms, and so forth. And at some point, the arm disappears, okay? But the rest of the image is there. Well, the arm abruptly vanishes, evaporates. So that was a partial vanishing. Part of what you were observing disappeared. You noticed it. You note that as gone. So gone does not imply gone for good. Gone doesn't mean that every single part of what you were observing disappears. For example, let's say that you have a widespread sensation in your body. A sensation arises like a burst of pain, and it's got a local and it spreads out broadly. Let's say that you zoom out to cover it. You implement that option with the noting. And as you're covering it, like the left quadrant sort of like abruptly collapses. The rest of the pain is there, but a chunk of it went ka-chunk. So that's an abrupt vanishing of part, or an abrupt diminishing, perhaps a diminishing to complete vanishing. So an abrupt diminishing of part of what you're observing, that counts as a gone. So part of it could disappear, and it may, or part of it can abruptly diminish, and it may abruptly diminish all the way to no longer existing, or it might just abruptly diminish sort of to a lower level or a smaller size. So essentially, flow is change that in some way is continuous. It's either wavy or it's like pixelated, so that even though each one of those little vibrations might in itself be disconnected, they sort of like tend to form something that seems fluid. But abrupt diminishings at the macroscopic scale, those are, I use the word gone for that. There's a tendency to assume that this is a very esoteric category and, maybe if I meditate for 20 years, I'll be able to detect this. So disabuse yourself of that notion. Every in-breath comes to an end. Every out-breath comes to an end. That's a touch sensation, and it ends. And it's obvious that the flavor called in-breath, that sweep of sensation, stops for a moment and is replaced by the flavor called out-breath. So don't ever say that I can't detect any vanishings. That's always there. Now you might say, well, that's trivial, but all gones are uncreated equal. I don't know if you quite catch the significance of that phrase. Maybe that just seems like a very enigmatic and strange way. Maybe you think I'm just wordsmithing to get your attention or to make it sound like I know something that you don't, or who knows what, okay? But all gones are uncreated equal. Doesn't matter how ordinary and banal it is. An airplane is passing and it's like sound, 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 gone. They say, well, so what? Of course, da. However, as you are paying attention to that kind of thing, you are gradually, over a long period of time, developing a sensitivity to detect the unborn source of consciousness. Each one of those is a little teeny learning that in and of itself would seem completely trivial. But once you begin to sum that over many instances, let's be honest, probably over weeks, months, years of practice, you start to notice that those moments of gone as I have defined it seem to be momentarily adverting, that is to say, directing your attention towards something that's actually not a thing. And therefore it can't really be sensorially experienced, but can be contacted, let's put it, it can be contacted through the senses, it just can't be experienced as a sensory experience. And as you contact that more and more, 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, 100,000 times, if you have that category, it starts to become clearer and clearer to you. Now, the clear can only be in your senses, obviously. So you might say that the after effect of noticing a vanishing becomes more and more well-defined in your sensory circuits. And you begin to discover some things that are intuitively obvious and some things that are actually quite counterintuitive. What is intuitively obvious is that if you're having an unpleasant experience in your body and or mind, and you're able to pay attention to the moments when parts of it vanish, that gives you a sense of relief. What is not at all intuitively obvious is if you're having a pleasant experience and you notice the vanishing, that increases your sense of fulfillment. That is actually quite counterintuitive. However, it is sensorially true, although logically it doesn't make any sense at all. The Tibetans have their own enigmatic phraseology. I'm not the only person in the Buddhist world that talks weird. The oneness of bliss and void. What in the world is that? Well, actually, it refers to a whole lot of things, but in the end, it's what I just talked about. And what is also not intuitively obvious is if you have a neutral experience, one that is neither pleasant nor unpleasant, and you note its vanishing, that there is great sensory fulfillment in that also. It is intuitively obvious that if you notice vanishings, that might reverberate through your senses as a restful experience. That as the result of noticing the moment when a burst of talk comes to an end, might be followed by some quiet. That's intuitively obvious. That you can have relative rest states, what I call relaxation, light, silence, peace, blank, quiet. So, some one or a combination of those could begin to pervade your sensory experience as the result of noticing vanishings. What is not intuitively obvious is that a sense of great richness should come from noticing vanishings. It would seem like bleakness would come from noticing vanishings, but actually a sense of richness can result. The way I like to conceptualize that is that The complexity of self and world is reduced to the simplicity of flow waves. But that then contains within it all the richness of the self and world is in those waves. And when the wave comes to an end, in the gone, the richness is still there, the richness is still there. The assumption is, when you're given this category, that you are supposed to be able to detect gone in all your sensory experiences. Touch, sight, sound, feel, image, talk, relaxation, light, silence, peace, blank, quiet. If you make that assumption, then you are setting yourself up for failure. That is not the assumption. If you do focus on change, restricted to noting vanishings, noting gone, the assumption is you will be able to find vanishing somewhere in your sensory experience. If only in the fact that if you have a lot of chatter, you have a lot of sentences. If you have a lot of sentences, you have a lot of periods. Each one of those endings is a gone. Talk, talk, gone, talk, gone. Or you're still alive, so you're going to take another in-breath, and it's going to come to an end. You're going to take another out-breath, and it's going to come to an end. So the assumption is that you can find gone if you have a lot of chatter and if you're still breathing. And the assumption is that that's all you ever have to focus on in order to do the technique absolutely perfect. All gones are uncreated equal. Soryu's teacher gives people koans. Of course, it's Rinzai Zen, but he says, I hope I'm not misquoting, but I think Soryu said this, the very best students don't need koans. They do their entire enlightenment process with the breath. Noticing that what happens at the moment when the in and the out breath ends, what happens at that instant is all there ever is, ever. So that's complete enlightenment. You're living inside zero. So that's a few things to say about this theme. Ending in Sanskrit is Nirodha, Nirodha. And that's also a synonym for Nirvana. And Nirvana means to blow out, literally. But it also means to quench a fire of suffering. But it also means to quench your thirst in the sense of being completely and totally fulfilled. Hence the richness in the void.